Okay, so by this point you should have ZCX downloaded and installed, and you should have some understanding of how to read YAML files. It's finally time to learn about the core concepts of ZCX. This video will be more of an overview, and in the next video we'll build on these concepts. The first term I need to quickly explain is button. This might seem obvious, but a button is an element on your controller, like these buttons, or these buttons that form the matrix. So a button is something physical that you can touch. Why am I explaining this? Well, the next term to learn is ZControl, or just control for short. In our ZCX configuration files, we define how controls behave. Usually, we'll just define a color, as well as any ClyphX Pro action lists the control should trigger when we interact with it. So why the distinction between buttons and controls? Well, as you'll soon see, one physical button can have many controls associated with it. Even though they may share one button, each control is completely separate, and each control has its own control definition. A control definition is just a fancy term for the YAML configuration in which we tell ZCX how each control should behave. Here's what a typical control definition looks like. Most control definitions will be like this one, with just a color and one or more gestures, though there are many additional options that you can set on each control. Another new term is gesture. If you've used ClyphX Pro's optional ZControls accessory, you'll be familiar with the concept. A gesture is a physical action that you perform upon a button. There are 6 gestures available in ZCX. Each of these gestures can fire a totally different command or action list. These gestures are press, release, long release, short press, and double click. Here's a visualization of how the different gestures work. I have this control definition, and I've defined a command for all 6 gestures. The only thing each command does is log the name of the gesture. If I strike the button quickly, we'll see 3 different gestures fire rapidly: the press, release, and short press. Now I'm going to hold the button, giving us a press and a long press, and when I release the button, we get a release and a long release. And finally, the double click. So with the double click, all of these gestures will be fired before the double click. But remember, you only need to define the gestures that you want to use. Just quickly, while 5 of the ZCX gestures were available in ZControls, ZCX uses simpler names for them. Okay, that's it for gestures, moving on. So a quick clarification, ClyphX Pro uses actions and action lists, which are just a combination of different actions. With ZCX, we have a new term, commands. A command is something that a control does in response to a gesture. Now, confusingly, the most common command you'll use just triggers an action list. We looked at this example just before. There are many different commands available in ZCX. We saw another command earlier, log, which simply prints a message to the log file. We can trigger different types of commands from the same gesture. So on a press, this control will trigger the ClyphX action list metro, toggling the metronome, and will print a log message to that effect. When we have multiple commands associated with a single gesture, we call it a command bundle. So, this is the gesture, this is a command bundle, this is a single command, and this is an action list. Now, because in most cases the only thing you want to do after a gesture is trigger an action list, we don't usually have to specify this CXP command. So if I was to get rid of the log command, I could simplify the syntax. Okay, let's move on to something more interesting, modes. As we learned in the overview video, any control can be a modifier for any other control. That means that when we hold the modifier control, our other controls can change their behavior by, for example, firing different action lists. Look at this example. So with this record control, a press will normally fire the action srecfix8, which starts a fixed length session recording for 8 bars. As you may have guessed, when the shift mode is active, it will do srecfix16, recording for 16 bars. We can even require multiple modes for certain functionality. This example is a bit silly, but hopefully it illustrates the point. To use modes, we first specify a gesture, in this case press, and then the name of a mode preceded by 2 underscores. For multiple modes, we add a double underscore between the name of each mode. To enable and disable modes, we use another set of commands. take a look at this definition for the control shift. So here's two more commands, mode on and mode off. They turn the mode called shift on and off. Now I'm using a control called shift to toggle the mode called shift, but this control could trigger any mode. Maybe I want to have a mode called drums. So I'd change the control definition like so. I also need to tell ZCX that we have this drums mode, so I'll open modes.yaml and add drums to this list. Now I can go back and change shift for drums. So you can have any number of modes, all with arbitrary names. And that's the basics of modes. In ZCX, we make a distinction between matrix controls, meaning controls that are part of this matrix or grid, and controls that are not part of the matrix. For controls that aren't part of the matrix, we call them named controls. So far, we've mostly been looking at named controls. All named controls are defined in one place, namedcontrols.yaml. These names have already been associated with the MIDI messages sent by your controller, which is why we don't have to specify their CC or note number. You can always check the hardware reference if you're not sure which name to use for a control. Matrix controls are a bit trickier, but before we talk about defining matrix controls, we need to talk about matrix sections. In ZCX, a matrix section is a slice of the matrix that you carve out. Here I've got 3 different sections, and to demonstrate this concept, I've made them 3 different colors. The idea is to have related controls all grouped together as one unit. And then each matrix section has its own YAML file. So instead of trying to navigate one file with 64 different control definitions that are unrelated, we break each unit down into a matrix section. Matrix sections can be a rectangle of any height and width. So here's a crazy example. Each of these different colors is a different matrix section, each with its own YAML file. You might even want to have a section that takes up the full width and height of the matrix. So let's take a look at some matrix control definitions. This file is part of the demo config for push 2, so most of the definitions are basically blank. You might recognize this as a YAML list because we've got this little dash before each definition, and I've also got comments here denoting each row and column. So if I go down to say row 3, column 2, I'm just going to change this from grey to pink, and when I reload my live set, we'll see that change on the controller. So to define a matrix section, the first place we go is matrixsections.yaml. We can see that for each section, I've defined a start and end for the rows and columns. And looking at this diagram at the top, we can see the indexes go from 0 to 7. To make a new section, we just have to add an entry here, giving it a name and 4 bounds. I'll add a new one at the top of this file, and I'm going to make it occupy the top half of the matrix. And now we need to create a new file inside the matrix sections folder, and it needs to be called mycoolsection.yaml because that's the name I gave it in matrixsections.yaml. So that file's now created. We defined this section as an 8x4 grid for 32 controls total. So we need to create a YAML list with exactly 32 entries. If we don't, ZCX will throw an error when it loads. I'd also like to have these comments showing each row and column. I'm not going to type it all out manually though. I'm going to load the documentation at zcxcore.com, and at the top here I'll click Resources, which takes us to this matrix section config generator. I'll set the number of columns to 8, and just uncheck a couple of these boxes for now. Then hit Generate, and now I've got this skeleton config. I'll hit this copy button here, and paste it into the file we just created. So I've got color 127 here, which on the push 2 is a bright red. So when I reload ZCX, the top half should be red, right? Not quite. It's exactly as it was before. That's because there's one more thing to understand about the matrix in ZCX. So we have controls that belong to matrix sections, but all of these matrix sections here belong to a matrix page. And a matrix page is simply a collection of sections. At the top here, I've got these 6 buttons, which each correspond to a different page. So each page can have a totally different layout or set of sections. But you can see here on the first and second pages, the top half is exactly the same. That's because you can have the same section appear on multiple pages, or even on every page. And I'm going to go back to that first concept I introduced about buttons and controls. Here I'm pressing a button, and in doing so I'm performing a gesture on a control. Now I've changed to a different page, and while I'm still pressing the same button, it's now a different control. But what about now? Well, it's still just one button, but it's actually just one control as well, because this exact control exists on multiple pages. So how do we modify pages? First, open up pages.yaml, and here you can see my 6 pages. Now, if I want this first page, home page, to have our new section, I could just get rid of actions top, left, and right, and add the new section in its place. And now we've got this new bright red section where the old ones used to be. What about adding a whole new page? I'll go back and put home page how it was before, and now I'll add a new page called new. And this order in pages.yaml is the order that ZCX will use. So I'll reload. And now we can see that there are 7 page buttons up the top here. I've got my new page, and then the old home page, and all the other ones too. Now, by the way, you're not limited to 8 pages. You can have any number of pages, and you don't need to use these buttons up the top to switch between them. That's just the default configuration. Or you might not want to deal with pages and matrix sections at all. It's perfectly valid to have just one page with one matrix section. In ZCX, there are a variety of control types. The controls we've looked at today are called standard controls, and most of the controls you define will probably be standard controls. But there are more specialized controls as well. These special control types are usually concerned with displaying LED feedback. One example is the transport control. On this play control, we've got the key value pair, type, transport, so we can tell that this is a transport control. And under it, we have transport, play, and this means the control will use one color when the transport is playing and another when the transport is stopped. Now, this transport control is only concerned with LED feedback, so we still need to manually define any gestures and commands. So I've got one press gesture, firing the action list set play, which toggles live transport. And without any additional configuration, we have smart feedback. There are too many control types to explain here, but you can find all the details in the control reference at ccxcore.com. Now we're going to talk about templating. This is more of an advanced concept, but having a basic understanding of it now is important because it's used all throughout the demo configuration, and getting to grips with templating will make your life a lot easier. Templating in ZCX is about reducing repetition. If we have 8 controls that act very similarly to one another, ideally we should specify the common part only once rather than 8 times. This obviously saves us a lot of typing, but it also means we can make a change in one place and see that change across our 8 controls, or however many controls we choose. Let's look at this definition in namedcontrols.yaml. This definition is called state row. When we see a name like this with 2 underscores at the start, we're looking at a group definition. That means we're going to specify multiple controls and apply the same control definition to them. This includes keys where we tell ZCX which controls form the group. In this case, it's the push's state buttons 1 through 8. Now, while with control names we need to use the predefined control names, group names are up to you, but a group name must be preceded with a double underscore. You'll see that this group has type page. This is another special control type, and it shows one color if its page is active and another color if its page is inactive. Now, this page option is where we tell the control which page belongs to it. It can be either a page number or a page name, but here we have some really strange syntax. We call this a template string. In ZCX, when you see some text that starts with a $sign and a curly brace and ends with a closing curly brace, you're looking at a template string. This is mainly a way for us to dynamically fill information. Inside this template string, we have me, and here me refers to the individual control, and then .index, which is referring to that control's position in the group. So for this first control, state 1, the index will be 0. State 2 has an index of 1, and so on. Further down, in gestures, we've got another new command type, page. So the page command again takes a number or name and switches the matrix to that page. And we've got this exact same template string, me.index. So the first control is going to fire the command page 0, which is the first page in ZCX. State 2 is going to do command page 1, and so on. So with template strings, by far the most common property you'll be referring to is the index, but each control has many properties we can refer to. Now this press gesture has two commands in the bundle, page and MSG, or message. So message takes a string and shows it briefly at the bottom of Live's UI. And here we've got multiple template strings in this same string. So when I press this button, it'll change to the relevant page and show me a message with the page number and page name. You can see every property that a control has in the control reference. We'll look at one more templating example. Here I've got a group called Scene Group, and it includes all 8 scene buttons. So we can use template strings in ClyphX Pro action lists as well. As you might have guessed, pressing Scene 1 is going to do the action list Scene 1, and so on for each of the 8 buttons. You might notice that I'm using index with a capital I. If I used index with a lowercase I, Scene 1 would try to fire Scene 0, which isn't a thing. Scene 2 would fire Scene 1, and so on. So ZCX wants numbers in a 0-indexed format, like we did with pages, but ClyphX wants numbers in a 1-indexed format. Now I could do me.index plus 1, because template strings are actually Python expressions, but it's easier to just use this shorthand. Now maybe I'll decide later that I don't want these scene controls to launch scenes. Maybe I want these controls to toggle devices 1 through 8 on the selected track. We can do this really easily by just changing the action list. And with that one change, we've modified 8 controls in just a couple of seconds. Now each demo config has a few group definitions predefined, but you may want to define each control individually. If so, you can simply delete or comment out this entire group definition, and underneath the group you'll find a commented definition for each control that comprises the group. So I'll select all these empty definitions and uncomment them by hitting Command and /. That's where we'll leave templating for now. Like I said, this was just the basics. If you'd like to know more, you can head to the template reference for all the details. The last thing we're going to cover in this video is encoders. Now encoders basically means knobs and faders. If you've used the optional ClyphX Pro bindings accessory, you should be able to understand encoders in ZCX right away. To define encoders, we use encoders.yaml, and like with named controls, we have a YAML entry for each encoder. Just like how we have group control definitions, we can have group encoder definitions too. Now this demo config is fairly complex, but encoder definitions don't need to be complicated. Down here I've got the definition for our master encoder. Usually each encoder only needs one option, this binding option. So we can see that by default, the encoder is controlling the main track's volume, and with the mode shift active, it's going to control the cue or preview volume. If I didn't want to use modes, I could even simplify this definition. There are many targets you can bind encoders to, including the vast majority of targets available in the ClyphX Pro bindings accessory. This includes targets like track volume and device parameters. There are too many to list here, but you can find the full list in the encoder reference. Okay, that's all for this video. I know that was a lot to take in, so good job with getting this far. And don't worry if these concepts haven't sunk in yet. In the next video, we're going to be starting from a blank config, and you'll see me build a custom config from start to finish. I also want to let you know about something we call the demo tour. On the website, you'll find a demo tour for each ZCX-enabled controller. In this tour, we'll explain all the pages, sections, name controls, and encoders that come with the demo config for your particular hardware. And finally, if you need help with anything ZCX related, feel free to ask for help in the ZCX Discord server, which you can find at discord.zcxcore.com.